to my podcast, Love and Courageous. I'm your host, Demetris. And for today's episode, I'll be speaking about the history of women's rights in America. So, a lot of people say make America great again. But, however, if everybody was to educate themselves on the true history of America, they will know that America was never great. So, I'll be taking everybody down memory lane and talking about the property rights, the credit card rights, and education rights that women did not have in America. So it starts in 1769 when the colonies based their laws on the English common law, stating, by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in the law. The very being and legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated into that of her husband, under whose wing and protection she performs everything. Basically saying that a woman, her rights is very limited. She does not have as many rights as her husband does. In 1771, New York passed the act to confirm certain conveyances and directing the manner of proven deeds to be recorded. And legislation gave a woman some say in what her husband did with their assets. This law required a married man to have his wife's signature on any deed to her property before he sold or transferred it. It also required that a judge met privately with the wife to confirm her approval. 3 years later, Maryland passed a similar law that required a private interview between the judge and the married woman to confirm her approval of any trade or sale by her husband of her property. Now, while the white woman may not have been allowed to own property, she was allowed to prevent her husband from using his property, which is partially hers, in a way that she found unacceptable. This law was put into test in 1782. The case Flanagan's Lessee versus Young. It was used to invalidate a property transfer because no one had verified if the woman involved actually wanted the deal to go through. Massachusetts passed a law in 1787 allowing married women in limited circumstances to act as femme sole traders. The term femme refers to women who were allowed to conduct business on their own, especially when their husbands were out to sea or away from home for any other reason. Now, even though these states passed these laws only referred to white women. Because slavery was still in place, black people did not have property rights because black people were seen as property. Now, in the 1800s, people of color did not have property rights, even though things were starting to improve for the white women. In 1809, Connecticut passed a law permitting married women to execute wills. Various courts enforced provisions of prenuptial and marriage agreements. This allowed a man other than a woman husband to manage the assets that she brought into the marriage in a trust. Such arrangements still deprived women of agency, and they likely prevented a man from exercising total control of his wife's property. In 1839, Mississippi law passed giving white women limited property rights, largely involving slavery. For the first time, white women were allowed to own enslaved black people, just as white men were. New York gave women the most extensive property rights, passing the Married Women's Property Act in 1848, and the Act concerning the rights and liabilities of husband and wife in 1860. Both of the laws expanded the property rights of married women and became a model for other states throughout the century. Now, due to these laws, women could conduct business on their own, have sole ownership of gifts they received, and file lawsuits. The act concerning the rights and liabilities of husband and wife also acknowledged mothers as joint guardians of their children, along with the father. This allowed married white women to finally have legal authority over their own kids. White women were likely to hold enslaved people as property as compared to other types of property. Slave-owning parents were likely to gift enslaved black people to their daughters, and enslaved people were perceived as easier for white women to control than other types of property, such as land. Enslaved black people played central roles in southern credit markets. Slave owners saw many benefits to the use of enslaved people as collateral for loans, and most southern states that passed married women's property laws before the Civil War included a debt relief component in those laws. These provisions stated that a wife's enslaved human property could not be seized to pay her husband debt, but often also guaranteed that the husband would have control over the labor of these people as well as ownership of profits from their labor. These laws provided a continuing revenue stream and economic stability to white slaveholding families during a time of economic turbulence. In 1839, Mississippi bill illustrates some of the dynamics. 4 out of 5 provisions of the bill deal explicitly with enslaved human property. These sections of the law gave white married women ownership over enslaved people they brought into a marriage, exempted this property from their husband's debt, and gave control, management, and profits to the husband. Both formal laws and informal practices made it very difficult for black people to buy land and obtain homestead. Native people were being stripped off their lands through the settlement of the West. And even though Native Americans had property rights, the government violated those property rights of the indigenous people with broken treaties, forced relocations, and colonization. Now, due to these laws, it made it less likely that black and native women could even hold property, especially land after marriage. With laws prohibiting interracial marriage, also became increasingly likely to deny inheritance rights to black and native widows and multiracial children in favor of white relatives. By 1900, every state has passed legislation modeled after New York Married Women's Properties Act of 1848, granted married women some control over their property and earnings. Now, when it comes to black land ownership, the black community have lost a lot of their land back in the mid-19th century, where in some states black people were prohibited from owning land after the Civil War ended. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves, but it did not guarantee a right to land ownership. While the 40 acres and a mule promise would have been the first large-scale reparations attempt for newly freed slaves, it was overturned by Andrew Johnson during his first few months of presidency. Now, with segregation on the rise and land ownership dispute, black farm land ownership steadily increased in the late 1800s and hit an all-time high national average in 1910, with 14% of all farm owner operators were black people. This was in the years following the Civil War, in which free slaves and their descendants accumulated 19 million acres of land. During the Reconstruction period, black landowners purchased every affordable plot of land that they could. Between the years of 1910 and 1997, black people lost about 90% of their farmland. One of the main reasons is due to heirs property, where descendants of landowners inherit land from their family but have no will or legal documentation that proves their land ownership. Heirs property law still persists today. In the early 1900s, white supremacists backlash spread in America. A lot of black men were lynched by white landowners because they wanted the black man land. Violent mobs often beat and threatened to murder black farmers if they did not abandon their homes. In 1912, over the course of 2 months, a mob drove out more than 1,000 black people from their homes in Forsyth County, Georgia. From 1920 to today, the percentage of black landowners dropped from 14% to 1.3% across America. Discriminatory lending practices gave unequal loans to land grant universities for black farmers, prohibit people of color from owning land. In 1997, John Boyd Jr. and 400 other black farmers sued the USDA in the landmark lawsuit Pig 4 versus Glickman, alleging that USDA officials ignored complaints brought to them by black farmers and they were denied loans and other support because of rampant discrimination. The case was then settled 2 years later, with the government distributing $50,000 each to over 16,000 farmers. From 2006 to 2016, black farmers were 6 times more likely to be foreclosed on as white farmers. Most states have overturned their discriminatory land laws, but some states' property laws are still being reviewed. Black farmers also make less than $40,000 annually, while white farmers make over $190,000. The Justice for Black Farmers Act bill that was introduced in the U.S. Senate seeks to expand black-owned farmland by up to 32 million acres through land grants over the next 10 years. The bill also increased funding for a USDA program to end the issue of here's property. Half of the $10.4 billion introduced in the rescue plan will go to disadvantaged farmers, a quarter of those who are black. When it comes to credit cards, women did not have the rights to have a credit card in their name until 1974. Before 1974, the credit market prevented women from fully entering the consumer economy that arose in America after the World War II. Women applying for a credit card or a loan could expect to be asked a host of personal questions. The questions pertain to their marital status, whether women had available and willing male co-signers, such as husbands, brothers, cousins, uncles, or male friends. Even if women have full potential to repay the loan or credit card, banks would often discriminate based on reasons that had no bearing on financial abilities. Without a male cosigner, banks were unwilling to lend a woman money, severely inhibiting a woman's financial freedom and economic opportunities. Now, before 1974, in 1971, the legal case Reed versus Reed, Ruth Bader Ginsburg co-wrote a brief argument against a provision of an Idaho state law regarding the preference of men over women as administrator of an estate. The court agreed, ruling unanimously that dissimilar treatment on the basis of sex between men and women was unconstitutional. This ruling paved the way for the Constitution's 14th Amendment and Equal Protection Clause to be applied to gender discrimination cases. 3 years later, and amid a wave of activism, Congress passed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974, also known as ECOA. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act banned discrimination against a financial borrower on the basis of sex or marital status. 2 years later, Congress passed a bill titled the Equal Credit Opportunity Act Amendment of 1976 that amended the Equal Credit Opportunity Act to include the prohibition of discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, natural origin, age, and receipt of public assistance benefits. When considering applicants for a loan, banks were required to consider their credit worthiness only. Now, before this bill was even passed, black people were kicked out of the American banks after the Civil War. Instead, the credit used by the black community to establish businesses and help families was provided through non-traditional channels such as wealthy individuals or cooperatives with limited success. In 1865, a bank was established to serve black people known as Freedmen's Savings Bank, which operated 37 branches over 17 states and had 67,000 depositors. It came under the control of white financiers who used the bank's resources to fund speculative investments, losing the life savings of thousands of black depositors. Between the years of 1888 and 1934, 134 black-owned banks were formed to help the black community overcome challenges and serve as an important source of credit, while also providing training and jobs. In 1906, the Greenwood District of Tulsa, Oklahoma, also known as Black Wall Street, had a black bank and was one of the most prosperous black communities in America. It was eventually burned to the ground by white supremacists. Now, when it comes to education rights, in 1636, after British settlers established their colonies on the coast of North America, Harvard College began educating white men only until the 19th century. The first European universities trained students for careers in the church. Theology was the highest status degree, followed by law and medicine. Women could not become lawyers, priests, or physicians. Now, women in higher education did make a shift in the 19th century. This change challenged Victorian notions of women's roles, and a lot of colleges resisted pressures to switch to co-education. During the 19th century, women had two different routes for higher education. One, they could enroll at a co-ed institution like Arlyne College or a woman college such as Wesleyan College. In 1837, Arlyne opened their school to all students, including women and people of color. In 1862, the college awarded a degree to Mary Jane Patterson, making her the first black woman to earn a bachelor's degree. Access to higher education created new opportunities for previously excluded students. By 1900, 1 in 3 black professionals in America held a degree from Arlyne. Co-ed schools did not always treat male and female students equally. The first year, Arlyne began admitting women students, and they were dismissed from classes on Monday to do male students' laundry. After Wesleyan became the first women college, over the next several decades, other women colleges opened, such as Barnard College, Wellesley College, Bryn Mawr College, Smith College, Vassar College. 50 women colleges opened in America between the years of 1836 and 1875. Despite these breakthroughs, women still continue to face barriers during and after their education. In the 1870s, the University of Edinburgh refused to grant medical degrees to 7 women who spent years studying at the medical school. The Edinburgh 7 is what they were called. They faced professors who refused to teach them and male students who rioted when they sat for an anatomy exam. Eventually, several of the women who'd been denied a degree moved abroad to become physicians. A lot of the Ivy League schools did not admit women until the 1960s and 70s. Several paired up with sister schools that educated women. In 1879, Harvard created the Harvard Annex to educate women separately from its male undergraduates. The impetus for the change came from Elizabeth Cary Agassiz, founder of the Women's Education Association of Boston. The organization noted, I quote, "We were told not to disturb the present system of education, which is the result of the experience and wisdom of the past." Pressure from women, however, encouraged Harvard to expand the annex by the 1890s. Harvard had created Radcliffe College, a sister institution where women study under Harvard professors. By the 20th century, co-ed schools had become the norm rather than the exception. Now, when it comes to the southern states, by the 1830s, most of the states in America had passed legislation that forbid teaching enslaved black people how to read. Now, the black people that have became literate did so at significant risk. By 1865, after the end of the Civil War, more black people were putting pressure on the Republicans to update state constitutions to provide free public education to black children. With Jim Crow still in place, which was a legislation that had emerged once the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery, and Jim Crow was created to control every aspect of black people's life in America. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on Plessy versus Ferguson by confirming Louisiana's right to separate but equal railroad cars. In this landmark case, the federal government set a precedent that legalized segregation. Soon after, southern states began passing laws mandating segregation in public schools. Between 1930 and 1950, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as NAACP, began to sue over unequal pay for black educators. Also, the realization that more and more black labor was moving north to urban areas helped to increase spending in some southern black schools. By 1954, the Supreme Court had ruled on Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. In the ruling, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court admitted that separate education facilities are inherently unequal. Unfortunately, the idea of desegregation was met with resistance. For example, Virginia enacted the Stanley Plan, legislation designed to slash state funding for integrated schools. Aimed at avoiding integration, this approach enabled white families to enroll their children in private and segregated schools with the help of tuition grants. This resulted in public school districts being closed. Items that belonged to the now shuttered public schools were physically relocated to the private segregated schools. In 1957, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus sent the State National Guard to stop non-black students, known as the Little Rock Nine, from enrolling in a formerly white high school. The President Eisenhower sent federal troops to enforce the desegregation. And however, Eisenhower was not a civil rights supporter. He intervened mainly because he wanted to demonstrate that a state could not use military power to defy federal orders. Now, in 1960, which a lot of people should know, Ruby Bridges became the first black student at her New Orleans elementary school. She became the only pupil. The parents of all the other children in the school pulled them out of class in protest. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law. The legislation prohibits discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and nationality. 2 years later, the Coleman Report revealed the benefits of black students attending integrated schools, emphasizing the future importance of busing to desegregate public schools further. In 1971, Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education upheld busing as the best solution to racial imbalances at schools. 3 years later, the Supreme Court ruling set progress back a step when Milliken versus Bradley effectively legalized segregation by refusing to desegregate between school districts. This created inherent segregation between urban school districts that serve black families and the wealthy suburban school districts that serve white families. Even though the Supreme Court passed the bill, Brown versus Board of Education, segregation is still issued in public schools. There have been white parents that have been complaining about the schools not being segregated. Now that is all for today. Now we'll get into the Black History Fact for today. The Black History Fact will be about Arlyne Simone, a woman who invented a blood test that can detect when cancer patients reject a bone marrow transplant. Arlyne Simone is a biomedical engineer, a children's book author, and an entrepreneur with 2 medical device patents. She was born on the Caribbean island of the Commonwealth of Dominica. She moved to America when she was just 17 years old to enroll in college. She received her undergraduate degree from the Georgia Institute of Technology and completed her graduate studies in macromolecular science and engineering at the University of Michigan. During her graduate studies, she was a part of a team back in 2012 that developed and patented a blood test to detect when a cancer patient rejects a bone marrow transplant. She went on to pursue a diagnostic startup called PHASIQ and worked at a medical device company called Becton Dickinson. For my next episode, I will do a part 2, When Was America Great? So thank you everyone for listening to my podcast, and I hope you all have a lovely day.